Good afternoon. Hi, thank you. Thanks so much for being here. This is an amazing crowd. Thank you for being here. I'm so pleased to welcome you to the Humphrey School here at the University of Minnesota. I'm Carissa Slaughterback. I'm the Associate Dean here at the Humphrey School. I want to share this welcome on behalf of the school, on behalf of the university, as well as Dean Laura Bloomberg. She is traveling today. She's in Norway, working on collaboration with research institutions in Norway. And I think collaboration is a great theme for this event, and I know it's something that all of you are motivated by, and certainly something that reflects the work of the folks who you'll hear from today. So Laura sends her apologies that she can't be here, but I'm really pleased to be able to share a welcome on her behalf. So the topic of migration, immigration, and refugees is really critical for our society, for Minnesota, for our school, and we're so pleased to have a fantastic group of experts with lots and lots of experience, lots of credibility, and an immense amount of perspective that they're able to share with you related to this topic. Just a couple of housekeeping items that you might want to be aware of. One is we will not have a formal break during the program, so feel free to excuse yourself at any time. In addition, there will be a panel with question and answer toward the end of the event, and feel free to write questions on the note cards that are available to you, and feel free to just raise your hand at any time and someone will come by and be able to pick that up for you, and we'll use that as the basis for the discussion that'll happen later in the event. So with that welcome, I'm going to turn it over to Ambassador Ronald Newman. He's the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy. And Ambassador Newman has an exceptional career in public service and also in diplomacy. He served 3 times as an ambassador in Algeria, in Bahrain, and also most recently in Afghanistan from 2005 to 2007. His work has involved him extensively with the military throughout his career, including work related to Iraq and Afghanistan. And he continues to write and speak extensively on this work and is certainly a fantastic host for this event. And I'm so proud to welcome Ambassador Newman. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a treat to be back here. The Cisco Forum was endowed by the family foundation of our late Undersecretary Joseph Cisco, who was also president of the American University. And we're very pleased to have Carol Cisco, who's been the driver of this, here someplace, but I have lights in my eyes, and oh, there she is. I have no idea where she is. But Carol, thank you. We actually did a program here in 2007, and when Brian Atwood was the dean, and it was impressively done, and that's what enticed us to come back. Just a couple words about the Academy, and then I'll get out of the way, because nothing is really more tedious than long introductions when you came for the program. But the American Academy of Diplomacy is a somewhat unique institution. It was organized 33 years ago by interesting mixture of people. Dean Rusk, former Secretary Muskie, Henry Kissinger, George Kennan were among the founding members. So a pretty illustrious, Ellsworth Bunker, pretty illustrious bunch. As it has evolved over the years, it is still an essentially small organization of former senior diplomatic practitioners, not all career, some political appointees, some from aid, some from other branches, but pretty much all people who have at senior levels and multiple posts been engaged in the business of trying to get foreigners to do things our way, at least on an official basis. And it is non-governmental, it is non-partisan. It's about to get into one political fight, but that's not on a partisan basis. And its mission is improving American diplomacy, which it does both in going to public forums like this one, where we have a chance to sort of talk about how diplomacy interacts with issues of the policy and concern, as well as a certain number of reports where we talk about what might better be done by the State Department in terms of training and education and organization, things like, and resources. I think we're the only organization to have studied the State Department who has focused on the question of what resources do you actually need. A myriad of studies about form and organization and how you ought to put things together. I think we were the only ones who said, now, actually, how much money do you need to do this? We now have another critical issue, how many people do you need, because we're in the process of deconstructing the Foreign Service and American diplomacy under the current well, we don't have a reorganization. We have a lot of ideas about what a reorganization might become, although there's a plan that's theoretically gone to the White House, but I think it's an outline, general principles, not really a plan. But we also have a 30% cut proposed for the budget, and a shrinking of our professional diplomacy and a hemorrhaging of our most experienced people. So on a brief commercial note, I would say that I've not seen quite this much damage to the Foreign Service of the United States since Senator McCarthy. But that's another subject for another time. Here, our purpose is to talk about the manifold dimensions of immigration from the international perspective to the community, and I suspect that we will have the occasion in our different presentations to range back and forth across those, because they are in fact very intertwined, and while people get very wrapped up in the particular aspect, whether it's local or the policy or others, in fact you can't really do one without the other. Am I introducing Eric? Eric doesn't need, you're introducing, okay. So that man doesn't need any introduction here, but I'll let somebody who's capable do it. So with that, Dean, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Newman, for that introduction to the organization. And I think thank you so much for coming back to the Humphrey School. It's such a pleasure to have you here again. And again, thank you, Carol Cisco, for being here as well. I think we're really excited to be able to have this conversation and honor the memory of Dr. Cisco, and I think honor the service that he provided for many, many years on these important issues. So thank you so much for coming back. With that, the man who needs no introduction, apparently, Eric Schwartz is back with us today. Eric was the dean of the Humphrey School from 2011 until 2017, before he became president at Refugees International. So we're so pleased to have him back today and sharing his wealth of expertise and insight and perspective from the work that he's done over a very long career that has included a nice stop at the Humphrey School, where he was really influential in a lot of new initiatives here, and I think definitely helped to raise our profile here. He leads an organization now that advocates on behalf of refugees and displaced persons. He's jumped into that role, certainly tapping into an already high profile, and certainly engaging on critical issues that are especially important considering the current time that we're in. Eric's engagement on these issues is exceptional, and certainly he has a lot of perspective to share. Previously, he served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration, having been nominated by President Obama for that position. He also, in that position, he served with Secretary of State Clinton as the Department of State's top humanitarian official. His prior work includes service as the director of the Connect US Fund, which is a consortium of NGOs and foundations that are actively involved in promoting the U.S.'s international engagement. He also worked with the UN on tsunami recovery, as well as with the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, and many, many more details in his really great career. So we're happy to have Eric back. Thank you so much for coming back from Washington to join us. And Eric's going to share a few comments, and again, we'll have a fantastic panel and discussion as we go along. So thanks, Eric.
Thank you, Carissa, and hello, everybody, and many friends who I've spotted already. I was flying in, and I left here 5 months ago after 6 years as dean of the Humphrey School, and I was driving in from the airport, and I called my wife, Kathy, whom many of you know, and I said, "Everything looks so familiar," and she said, "You've been gone for 5 months. You were there for 6 years." So I thought that was pretty funny. What a pleasure, really, to be back. This is a wonderful environment under any circumstances, but certainly one really valuable environment to discuss the issues that occupy our attention today. This is a huge topic, and let me see if this thing works. Let's see. Doesn't seem to. Can I get some help? Let me try. You want to try it? Oh. There we go. All right. Kathy, that does not count against my time. Okay, we're starting now. This is a huge topic, and it's hard really to know how to focus 20 minutes of my time. So let me at least describe to you my ambitions for the next 20 minutes. All right? First, I'm going to want to provide you with some sense of the lay of the land around forced migration, which really refers to the need of people to leave their country of origin because, in essence, they don't have a choice. And the policy issues and policy imperatives surrounding forced migration. Then I'm going to touch a little bit on the broader issue of and questions of international migration and immigration to the United States, and then turn to Minnesota. And finally, I'll assess how we're doing on all of these issues. You may have noticed we're in the first 9 months of a new presidential administration. I had heard something about that. And we're going to try to do all that in 20 minutes. But first, I have to say a word about the organization I now serve as president, Refugees International. There are three elements that distinguish this organization. First, it's a refugee and humanitarian organization whose sole focus is advocacy based on fact-finding, field work, field missions. Most humanitarian organizations are involved in programs, often in partnership with governments. Not us. Our sole focus is policy advocacy connected based on field reporting. Secondly, we're an impartial and independent organization, which means we don't receive any funds from governments or international organizations as part of our effort to sustain our credibility, which means if any of you want to make contributions to Refugees International, I won't object. And finally, although the field of humanitarianism is quite broad, humanitarianism for us is not part of a broader advocacy agenda. It is our agenda. And so those factors taken together make the organization rather unique, and I think an important one. And the two photos there, that is the issues that inspired the establishment of the organization. The boat exodus of Vietnamese refugees in 1979. This was not the first wave of a refugee exodus from Vietnam. And then this, of course, is one of our latest reports on internally displaced persons in Iraq. So let me get to the presentation, and let me start with forced migration. As UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, as UNHCR figures show, the numbers of refugees and internally displaced persons around the world now number more than 65 million. And that's the highest number since these figures have been recorded. Of that number, more than 22 million are refugees, and most are in protracted situations that have lasted for many years. Refugees are formally defined as persons outside their country of origin who can't return due to a well-founded fear of persecution. That is, fear of severe and targeted mistreatment based on race, religion, nationality, membership of a social group, or political opinion. But as a practical matter, that definition has expanded over the years, most significantly to include those who are fleeing conflicts around the world, whether that's in southern Sudan, Somalia, Syria, or elsewhere. Thus, for example, while it might be difficult for a particular Syrian who has fled fighting in her country to say that she has an individualized fear of persecution along the lines that I've described along those five criteria, nobody would suggest that such a person is not deserving of protection. And for reasons that we can discuss, we generally refer to such people as to be included in the definition of refugee. And of course, the bedrock protection for refugees who are outside their country of origin is contained in the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees and made applicable to the whole world by a 1967 protocol to that convention, which is Article 33. Any former students in my class here? I hope future students. PA 5823. 1 credit course in February. You have to register for it. In any event, the bedrock provision of the convention is Article 33, which is that no refugee can be returned to a place where his or her life or freedom would be threatened. That's the prohibition on refoulement. So what about refugees? What to do about refugees? What are the legal solutions to the challenges that they confront, the durable solutions? Traditionally, there have been 3 durable solutions to the plight of refugees. The first is return to the country of origin when conditions have changed and permit return without persecution. Second, a second of 3 durable solutions is permanent integration into the country to which the refugee has fled. A solution that first asylum countries that are providing that protection, have generally resisted, but has happened on occasions. And third, resettlement in a third country, often in the global north, like the United States, a solution for only a small minority of refugees frankly, because resettlement slots are very few in number relative to the number of refugees. But one that is a critical alternative for vulnerable populations, and one that is important as a demonstration of solidarity between countries like the United States, which may resettle as many as tens of thousands a year, and countries, say, like Turkey, a country that the United States and others are asking to provide safe haven to millions of refugees. So I expect that most of you may have a traditional, or some of you, a traditional notion of a refugee camp or an encampment. On the left is a makeshift settlement. That's a photo I took, actually, of a makeshift settlement in Bangladesh in September. And on the right, I believe that's a refugee camp in Kenya. I believe that's near the Sudanese border. Someone help me. What's the name of the camp? What's that? Kakuma. Yeah. Wait. No, it's not Dadaab. Dadaab's on the other side of the country. I think it's Kakuma. Yeah. I'm not sure, but I think so. Though the idea is now probably wrong. The idea of these camps is probably wrong in most cases, in light of the fact that I missed a page here. Oh, yes. In light of the fact that most of the world's refugees are no longer in camps, but are in urban areas or living in host communities in non-urban settings. But last month, I traveled to Bangladesh, to a situation that in some respects is closer to what many people might think about when they think about refugees, to assess conditions impacting hundreds of thousands of Muslim Rohingya refugees who've been ruthlessly and violently driven from their homes in Burma. So I thought I would share this short video, if we can gear it up, as it describes the kind of situation confronting those who find themselves in flight of conflict, ethnic cleansing, and in this case, even crimes against humanity. So let's give this a shot and see if it works. Hold on. At the border between Burma and Bangladesh, in front of an area that they're calling here no man's land, between the two borders. Of course, some 400,000 other Rohingya have recently arrived in Bangladesh, and the situation and circumstances that they confronted really were unspeakable. Crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and terrible abuses that the world should know about. We've arrived in the Tyne Kelly camp. This camp, this whole area, was just established over the past many weeks. There are, believe it or not, 70,000 people living in this facility. Government officials are doing their best to provide services, but the situation is extremely challenging. So this was, this is one of the most outrageous human rights situations that I've encountered in my career. The forced, the driving out of well over 500,000 people in a matter of weeks from northern Rakhine State in Burma. And we can talk about that during the discussion if you'd like. So, but let me move on. Beyond the more than 22 million or so who are refugees, we now also have more than 40 million people who are forcibly displaced by persecution and conflict who are within their countries of origin. The far too anodyne a term, internally displaced persons, is used to describe this population. But they suffer no less than refugees, and in some cases more. Then that's because they are within the borders of their countries, and often do not obtain the kind of international support that is accorded to refugees. So, for example, while by mid-year there were more than 5 million Syrian refugees in neighboring countries, there were more than 6 million Syrians internally displaced in their country of origin. And then you can add to this, in terms of forced migration, add to this number an estimated 20 to 25 million persons a year who are displaced by disasters that result from natural hazards, exacerbated often by the impacts of climate change. And of course, many millions more who are leaving because they feel pressed to leave, escaping poverty, criminal violence in their countries, the northern triangle of Central America, or because they've been trafficked. So there is forced migration, both within countries and outside the borders of countries, a major challenge for the international community, for governments of the world. Why does all this matter to the United States? Why does it matter? Let me draw in part from my own inaugural address statement when I was sworn in as Assistant Secretary of State. In that statement, I asserted that the protection of the most vulnerable should be at the center of national security policymaking. First, there's the moral imperative and the simple policy goal of saving lives. The people of the United States, and in particular the U.S. Congress, have demonstrated really strong support for generous efforts to alleviate human suffering. We have a profound responsibility. Government officials do. We were, at the time I was a government official, to make good use of resources that have been provided. Secondly, we have the strongest interest in building sustainable partnerships and promoting U.S. leadership, the policy benefits of which include enabling the United States to drive the development of policies, program, and international standards like no other government in the world, and to leverage critical support from others. But American capacity to lead is integrally linked, first, to a U.S. willingness to assume the mantle of leadership. Second, a willingness to be prepared to practice at home what we preach abroad. And third, to stand for principles that governments and populations of the world can both embrace and can reasonably interpret as being both benign and supportive. And in this respect, the diversity of our country, the fact that we are a country not defined by race, by ethnicity, by ties to place, but rather defined by ideals of equality and inclusion, has given the United States historically enormous, incalculable advantages. And third, we have the strongest interest in promoting reconciliation, security, and well-being in circumstances where despair and misery not only threaten stability, but also critical national security interests of the United States. So, if that's forced migration, what about the fact that this session is also about migration? So let me talk a little bit, going a little bit beyond forced migration. And beyond forced migration, there is the migration of people within and between countries that is not necessarily forced, but for a variety of purposes. And in December 2016, the Pew Research Center estimated that the total number of people living outside their countries of origin was about 244 million, or over 3% of world population, with the United States of America alone accounting for about 20% of that total. In the difficult political climate that we confront today, many Americans make little distinction between immigrants and refugees. But whether it's refugees or immigrants, facts and not fear should guide policymaking. So if I may draw from another speech that I've given, you see, when you have to give lots of speeches, you go into your files and you see what you've said before. So if I may draw from another speech, which I gave to the Council on Foreign Relations some years ago, let me just note that at least as of about 7 years ago when I first gave the speech, over 40% of those in the United States could trace their ancestry to immigrants who passed through Ellis Island between 1892 and 1954. It's impossible to imagine the United States as a leading economic and political power that it is today without the contributions made by the over 120 million people who immigrated during this period. And of course, this doesn't include the many millions and millions who came to the United States prior to the 19th century or who have come since 1954. On balance, the data reveal that the overall effect on U.S. wages, on U.S. economic growth from immigration has been positive, and that over time, not only have tax revenues generated by immigrants far exceeded the cost of the services that they use, but immigration has been critical to the emergence of the United States as an economic powerhouse. Immigration has also helped the United States and is helping the United States to avoid many of the very troubling demographic trends that have in recent years bedeviled other advanced industrialized countries that have been less hospitable toward immigrants. As populations age, as birth rates decline, and the revenue streams needed to sustain social programs shrink, new entrants and their families have played a critical role in helping the United States to sustain our capacity to maintain and support social programs. And this is not simply historical information. A report produced by the University of Minnesota last year and written by my colleague Ryan Allen. Is Ryan here? There he is. Hey, Ryan, how are you? Predicted very troubling labor shortages in Minnesota in the decades to come without a large increase in international migration into Minnesota. In fact, the report concluded that in order to sustain a labor force growth rate of only 0.5%, Minnesota would have to attract 4.5 times the number of new residents that it currently attracts each year. So I see my 20 minutes of time is rapidly dwindling. How much do I have? 3. Uh-oh. Okay, I'm going to go fast now. What is the, maybe I'll go 22 minutes. What is the policy desiderata to address these many and formidable issues? What is essential to our capacity to realize our ideals, to promote U.S. influence and power, and to create a world that is more peaceful and congenial to American interests, however we define them? First, a willingness on the part of the federal government to continue to sustain and strengthen U.S. efforts to support funding for international and refugee assistance, which even at generous levels constitutes far less than 1% of our federal budget. Second, a willingness to sustain leadership in new efforts to provide solutions for refugees and displaced persons, such as new and creative ideas about refugee education, work opportunities, and self-sufficiency in countries of first asylum, to give them more meaningful lives in protracted situations. Third, U.S. leadership and efforts to address world conflicts that serve as root causes to refugee flight. Fourth, a willingness on issues like refugee resettlement to practice at home what we preach abroad. And fifth, a willingness to exercise enlightened political leadership on not only the critical issues of forced migration, but also the issues of immigration to the United States. So how do we assess the record? How has this administration done? Well, there have been serious and severe disappointments in each. Whether it was administration proposals thus far rejected by the Congress to dramatically cut humanitarian assistance, whether it was a failure to sustain new initiatives to enhance refugee rights and self-sufficiency in countries around the world. This is a UN conference on these particular issues that was held in September 2016, in which the new administration has not sustained active and engaged and forward-leaning approaches. Or whether it was an absence of leadership to deal with root causes in places like Yemen. Or whether it was continued restrictions on refugee admissions that aren't merited by evidence of risk, but send unfortunate signals to friends and allies around the world. I didn't have very flattering things to say about President Trump's decision last week on the refugee admissions program. Or whether it was failure to exercise enlightened leadership that relies on evidence, This is the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Evidence matters, rather than appeals to our fears. So what do? I'm almost done, Kathy, I promise. All right, one more minute. To be sure, answers are rather elusive in the political climate in which we find ourselves, but we have no choice but to persevere. First, friends of refugees, allies, need to work more closely with Congress and work with the administration to seek to augment its interest in humanitarianism. Nikki Haley has said good things on these issues. Admiral Gary Hall at the National Security Council, Deputy Secretary John Sullivan, Ambassador Kelly Curry at the UN, all of whom have expressed interest and concerns about refugees and humanitarian issues. So we have to work with the administration on these issues. Secondly, advocates like me must increase our efforts to promote nonpartisan engagement in these issues. This is a task force which we put together at Refugees International with an even number of Republicans and Democrats, and then some who are affiliated with neither party. And we must go beyond the Beltway of Washington, D.C. to engage communities around the country, both those who have strongly supported refugees and immigration and those who have not. And finally, we have to engage international organizations and other governments, recognizing while that the U.S. plays a critical role in the world, others have critical roles to play. The interests, my last slide, the interests and the fate of the world's refugees and other forcibly displaced persons, I think, depends on these efforts. As importantly, I believe the fate of our nation depends on these efforts. Thank you.
What order do you
Well,
want?
tell you what, let's leave this one. So if we get too excited, we just kind of jet back, get things to the wall behind us. Been on podiums where you had a hole behind you, it might be worse. That was a notable How are we now? Better? Okay. That was a notable performance by my colleague, your friend, on the policy and notably controlled in timing. This is always a problem. I remember once being at an international conference on Afghanistan in 2006 at Lancaster House, very ornate place, and the British chairman was insistent that international heads of delegations stick to the time. And so he would begin to rap his gavel when they exceeded, and they would gradually hunch their shoulders as though there was a wind blowing and continue speaking. And that went on until the Russian delegate began, and he began by saying that what he had to say was much too important to be limited by any artificial time constraint, and he didn't propose to have any time limit whatsoever. After that, he said nothing of note. We will try to be a little better on both. So we're now going to take this discussion to a little different level, and we've got two very different speakers, and I presume presentations. And on the one hand, we've got Dr. Maiko Hang, who is to my left. Many of you probably know her. She's the CEO of the Amherst Wilder Foundation. She has a very broad background in improving lives and working on low-income and disadvantaged populations. I noticed that she's prepared for this by having 3 degrees, a BA in psychology, an MA in social policy and distributive justice, and a doctorate in public administration. This seems to kind of encircle both the psychological and the managerial aspects of what she's engaged in. She's chair of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis and a variety of philanthropical organizations, and brings a very interesting experience in the local impact of our subject tonight. And then my colleague, Ambassador Phyllis Oakley, also a broad but very different background, many different aspects in the State Department, including having been Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Research, which is a job that makes you rather careful about how you analyze things. But she was also Assistant Secretary for Population, Refugees, and Migration, PRM, the bureau in the State Department that handles not just the placement of the interface between the international organizations and what happens to people as they get to the States as refugees, but the whole gamut of policy issues. She's also worked in and with the Agency for International Development on humanitarian assistance in Pakistan, Afghanistan. Shows you how long we've been doing that. And she's now an adjunct professor, and I'm very glad that we were able to get her back with us. And then just to give you a sense of how we're going to do this, my colleagues are each going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to do a bit of moderated discussion before I turn you loose on them, and that will bring us to the end of the program. So we didn't really agree who's going to start.
All right.
You agreed, okay.
Is this on? All right, thank you. As Elizabeth Taylor said to her husbands, I won't keep you long. Since the end of World War II, both our policies on admissions and resettling refugees and our levels of humanitarian assistance have been remarkable. And I believe strongly that they should be maintained. But above all, it is the American people who deserve the praise for the success of our refugee programs, both for their outreach in resettlement, but their support for these high levels of assistance. There is no doubt that the U.S. has been the world leader on humanitarian assistance for displaced persons and refugees. I remember as a young child in St. Louis seeing DPs come through Union Station. Does anybody remember what DP stands for? Displaced persons. And the women had on babushkas, and they carried around their necks the plastic sacks with their identities and their tickets, and they were moving on. But the first real refugee resettlement activity came in the early 1960s with the resettlement of Cuban refugees. And I don't know who it was in the U.S. government who organized this, but they did it through the networks of churches. And that pattern of resettlement, I think, has been largely responsible for the success of these programs because it reached out all over the country and took volunteers who were still operating today. There are other organizations that do it, but there are still, the basis is still the church groups within the United States. I'm sure it must be the Lutherans here in Minnesota. It's interesting to me that UNRWA, for the care of the Palestinian refugees, was founded in 1948. And that was before UNHCR was founded. So that's always been a little bit apart. And as Eric said, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees was established about 1950. Now, I have heard a story that Eleanor Roosevelt really opposed the creation of this refugee organization because she didn't think there were going to be any more refugees. Well, you look at the numbers today and you think, oops, and that was one that she got wrong. Anyway, I remember my mother, through her church work at a small congregational church outside St. Louis, working with all the women's organizations of the church to resettle Cuban refugees in the 1960s. And the object of this was to spread refugees all over the country so that they wouldn't be a burden in any one particular place. Well, we've since learned, guess what happens? Refugees like to gather together. And so you have the Vietnamese, mainly in California, lots in the Washington, D.C. area, and on the southern Gulf Coast as the fishermen in those Gulf areas. Somalis, some of them didn't like to go to some of the, I've heard, public housing projects in Memphis. And there was a whole migration of Somalis to Lewiston, Maine. Now, there might be a debate about which is colder and has a harsher winter, but that generally has been the pattern. A large group of refugees that came under the Lautenberg Amendment for evangelicals and Soviet Jews in the late 70s and 80s, they went to big cities. They went to Brooklyn, Chicago, and Los Angeles. You know, there are parts in New York, they say, down outside of Brooklyn, where you hear more Russian than English today. Maybe some of you have encountered that. I do believe, looking back on this, that the most important international model for cooperation was established under the Vietnamese program. Vietnamese, not right after the fall in '75, but a lot in the late 70s and early 80s were fleeing Vietnam in unseaworthy boats, and they were landing all over Southeast Asia. Those countries felt they couldn't take them in because they couldn't afford to support them. So they'd push these boats back off, and the people were dying, and they were also subject to pirates. Now, in the most amazing effort on international cooperation, all these countries got together under U.S. leadership, and the host countries, Australia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Thailand said, okay, we'll take them in, they can land. And the UN said, we'll set up the camps and we'll take care of their well-being. And resettlement countries, led by the United States, but also Canada, Australia, New Zealand, many of the European countries said, after a screening process, which will be done by the UN, we will take these people in as refugees. And Vietnam said, okay, if you take all these people, off our backs, we will accept the others who were screened out to come back to Vietnam. Now, think of the organization that went into that effort, led by the United States, and it was a huge success when you think about it. I hope that that is the subject of lots of PhD dissertations and such things. When I became the assistant secretary in the early 1990s, the biggest issue that we were dealing with was the Balkans, the break apart of Yugoslavia. And I think many of you will remember that, how difficult that was. Mrs. Ogata, a small, dynamic Japanese woman, was the head of UNHCR then. And the European countries, mainly, with support from the US, continued to supply food and aid. And Mrs. Ogata told me, she said, I am so proud that in the Balkans, there were only 2 cases of starvation. And those were 2 old men living alone who were too proud to ask for aid. That's an amazing story. Rwanda, when the people poured out into eastern Zaire, which was, shall we say, not very hospitable, and it was a difficult period, I was lucky enough to fly out with the Secretary of Defense because the US military was doing so much. And we came in and flying down from Cairo, flew over eastern Zaire, looking down at these refugees, and below was a sea of blue. The UN color is blue, and they had provided blue tarps, blue tents, and there, perched on the lava rocks there, was this whole scene of people being cared for. We keep thinking this is going to be the last big problem, that soon that we won't, but we know every time that something new comes along, whether it's the Rohingyas, whether it's the Syrian refugees coming out. And I believe the need for US leadership, not only in what we do in resettlement, but spurring the international community to cooperate and share the burden, and then the vast sums of money that nobody talks about these days of what we give to the various UN organizations that have been set up to handle humanitarian disasters. Many people in the US have various views of the UN, and I understand that. But the one area you cannot fault them for is humanitarian relief. And they have really done an outstanding job. So I say, keep America as the leader in humanitarian relief. I have 2 minutes? Good. Over to you.
We're being cued, so we know how many minutes we have. So I'm the president of the Wilder Foundation, and Wilder is 111 years old. Founded in 1906, and for that entire history, we have served immigrants and refugees. At first, it was English, Irish, Italian, Polish refugees, and today about 40 years ago, it changed to being Southeast Asian refugees, Hmong, Vietnamese, Cambodian, and now it's becoming more East African. but it's because of the kind of organization we are. So we're an organization that's dedicated to improving lives, especially those in the East Metropolitan area. And then we have a large research arm. We do about 180 to 200 some research studies a year here, mostly in Minnesota, but sometimes nationwide. A lot of it about immigrants and refugees. And then we have an area of the foundation that does civic engagement. It's called Wilder Center for Communities. So leadership development, civic engagement, everything that you could imagine. So that's the Wilder Foundation. I've been president for 7 years. And what the bio doesn't tell you is that I was one of these refugee kids that was actually resettled. So I am an example of what Phyllis and others have worked for all of their lives, which is, kind of bittersweet, actually, sitting up here on the panel, because we can do this, America. We all become something, and we're just the newest Americans that arrive at this door, and then we go on and do other things in the community. So I can tell you that the work that we all do is really, really important as humanitarians, not just at the local level, but at the international and global level. I keep getting drawn into global affairs, though. Some of it's because of my background, and some of it is because of Minnesota. Minnesota has an unusual history, a very strong helping tradition with resettling people from other countries. So I was asked to give the Minnesota perspective, and here's the reality. Immigrants and refugees start businesses at 3 times the rate that native-born people do. So like organizations like the Minnesota Chamber are really pro-immigration. Immigrants have a positive effect on the economy. As the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank Board, looking at maximum employment and price stability, the thing that grows our economy is people, consumption, household formation, employment. There are reasons why these things are tied together. We have, last time I checked in the state of Minnesota, we had 100,000 jobs that were vacant, open, from factory worker to, working in government, whatever it might be. Immigrants and refugees tend to be younger. They have younger families, more potential. My family came to the U.S. when I was 4, and I have 4 siblings. Everybody graduated from college. 3 of us were Ivy Leaguers. I mean, fairly unusual, but I would say not impossible. I hit 200% of poverty in the 10th grade. So 10 years of deep poverty, and then the rest of my life, I was fine. So family formation is really important to driving consumption productivity in America, especially here in Minnesota, where we have a declining population rate. Without in-migration from immigrants, we wouldn't have people to fill these jobs. So not only in my personal role or professional role at Wilder are we called to be champions of humanity, but it's really good for our economy to do that. Now, the real human impact here at a local level is that each consecutive wave of immigration or refugeeism, there's a similar pattern, whether you're coming from Syria or from Southeast Asia, you're moving through an adjustment process. And that's where Wilder comes in, because resettlement organizations resettle them, and then we stay with them. We serve them, and we help them to survive and then thrive in society. I should also say that I have worked at 2 refugee camps as an adult. I worked through Refugees International on a partnership. This was before Eric got there, at a repatriation center in northern Thailand. These were people and orphans, basically, who could not be sent back to their country of origin, and they just were stuck there for like 20-some years. So I, as a Hmong American, this was post-Brown University. I was actually here at the Humphrey School. I graduated early because I said to the dean at the time, happened to be Dean Brandel, hey, I really need to go on this international advocacy trip and go help the State Department. So I ended up over there working with the Joint Voluntary Agency as a volunteer and actually processing refugees. These are stories that are hard to hear. I mean, children who are abandoned and then sent from one camp to another. who are stuck in limbo. Forced migration at a very young age, don't know who their parents are. One of the worries of the refugees at the time, first time I was in the refugee camp, families didn't want to resettle into a third country because they would be saddled with their airplane tickets. They would be saddled with debt. So they would be strangers in a strange land and they'd have to repay the government. Totally a surprise to me. People cited fears of loss of freedom and liberty and living the way that they wanted to. People were waiting for other family members who had been separated by decades of dislocation, displacement, wanting to be reconnected. You know, my own story is pretty tragic, actually, if you think about, I mean, every refugee family has their own history. I mean, I was saved by a village of lepers fleeing Laos. We made it, we didn't make it the first time, we made it the second time. 100 nights on a dirt floor is really hard living for a 3.5-year-old. And we forget, you know, these are the faces that we forget when we're talking about policy. Unless, like Eric and others, you have been in these countries and see this firsthand, it's impossible to not say, wow, this is a great strategy for helping humanity. So, you know, I guess I'd just like to wrap up by saying, you know, there are just a few things that we do as Americans that are really important to growing our country, growing our people, staying safe, and believing that hope exists in humanity, not just here, but all over the world. Because we're a country that was founded on democratic and civic principles, unlike many other countries, and that makes us special. And so the tradition of continuing in that route and being a world leader, not just, you know, across the global scene, but here locally, is very, very important. Why? Well, because the second time I went to into refugee camp, I was actually a human services director at Ramsey County, and I helped the county manager and public systems here locally completely redesign their intake processes to help refugees resettle here after Wat Tamkabuk was opened up. And it led to all of these accelerated processes that save money and time and have really helped generate a model for how we can do this all across the country. I mean, we are looked to locally as a leader of how to settle, orient, and acculturate refugees and immigrants into society. We couldn't have done that without the personal experiences of myself as a refugee kid, a public administrator, and someone who truly cares about society. And that's happening all over. You know, I'm just one example of the thousands of refugees that have been resettled into Minnesota.
Thank you both. We're going to take a few minutes to talk up here, as I said. And let me start off by noting, first, I am not in government. I am also out, nor am I a particular supporter of the administration, because actually my day job, we've just set up a letter opposing one nomination. But I want to raise some, but I say that because I'm going to raise some questions. And I think what we have heard makes it very clear about the importance of leadership, the larger role the U.S. plays in galvanizing and organizing responses. But I think we also have some questions of leadership to achieve what, that require us to pursue some detailed questions, to push down a little bit, at which point the questions get a little harder. They don't necessarily get clearer, I will tell you. And I will preface this by saying that I rather suspect that we're not going to solve them tonight. But let me start off with one to my three colleagues. And it is basically, what are the limits to principle? How do you define the outer boundary that the United States should accept in caring for refugees? Is it a number? Is it a percentage of our own population? Is the argument that if 1 refugee is a good for the United States, 1 million are more good, and 10 million are still good. In posing these questions, I'm not arguing against them, but I think that when you call on society to assume a burden, including of the taxpayers, and when you look at the number of countries in the world that have serious problems with populations that came to work, it's fair to ask the question, is there a limit? Is there a practical limit to the application of moral principle? Is there a limit to what, how do you figure out a limit that the country should be asked to absorb? Eric, we brought you back, but so we'll let you have a first crack.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose on some level, that could be a challenging or difficult question in certain contexts. I don't see it as a particularly difficult one in this context, and I'll explain why. First, you're asking it with respect to, how many people do we accept? And I will talk about that. But I think it's also a broader question, which is, how do we project, our power and influence in the world? Are the principles of democracy, inclusion, respect for human rights, which characterize our domestic political constitutional reality, are they applicable to the world out there? The world out there is a nasty place. And I think the experience of the first 9 months of the Trump administration is a powerful demonstration that our values that our values are in service of our interests. Because our influence as, and I realize I'm answering a question you didn't ask, but that's my prerogative. But it's important to understand that our influence as a great power is largely a function of the perception around the world, number one, of our willingness to lead, and number two, to a great extent, the values that we articulate as a great power, a commitment, dare I say, and I realize it's easy to be cynical about American foreign policy, but sort of the benign nature in certain respects of the effort to affect U.S. influence around the world. And when we are reduced to a government that is perceived as being purely transactional in our relationships, then what gives the United States of America its authority and power, much of the strength, what distinguishes us, becomes lost. And that is exactly what's happening right now. So I think you have to sort of pop the balloon on this notion that somehow values and interests are incompatible. They don't go together. I think I just don't think that's true. Now, how does it play out in terms of refugee resettlement? I don't see this as a particularly challenging question. If you were going to ask me, should the United States agree to resettle 3 million refugees next year, I think that would be a tough question, which we'd have to
That is part of the question.
But that's not the issue at play.
Because
right now, worldwide,
myself.
let's just put it in perspective. Worldwide last year, there were total resettlement, 65 million refugees around the world, right? And total worldwide resettlement was on the order of 200,000, all over the world, right? So President Obama made a gesture last year and said, we're going to increase our level of refugee resettlement in fiscal year 17, which didn't happen because of the Trump administration, to 110,000. To
I
110.
want to let the other two have it.
Okay, I'll stop. To 110,000. Where's Kathy with the card? But that level is a pittance compared to our overall annual level of immigration. So we're not close. I guess my point, Ron, is you're asking a theoretical question which we don't confront as a policy issue.
I'm going to pass that to Phyllis, because in a sense, Eric's answer is there is no contradiction in the projection of values. There has no limit, or at least we don't confront the limit. No. I know I'm misstating your answer because you misstated my question, but I don't want to let.
I didn't misstate it. I was straight up.
I don't want to let this get away. Okay. I am not sure that answer is wholly holds. I think it holds on the level in which you analyzed it in terms of dollars and numbers. Yet psychologically, the pushback that elected Mr. Trump would also seem to suggest that somewhere out there are political limits. I don't propose to have them. But Phyllis, let me pass the same question to you. Does this projection of values have no limits, or does the fact that we deny the applicability of limits for the moment pose a political problem? Can we simply proceed on that basis, politically?
This, a lot of the questions, Ron, that you posed are questions that one could face all the time in your daily life. If I give to this man on the street, should I give to everybody? And then am I really giving enough to them, or should I give more to the church or more to my school? And we all have to work this out. It was long established, at least when I was the head of PRM, that return home is the preferred option for most of these refugees. That's what they want to do. They want to go back and reestablish their lives, their families, their connections. And so I don't think it's a question of numbers that we have to take. The second way of solving refugee problems that Eric talked about was local integration. And this used to be easier when areas were not so superpopulated. But when you look at the numbers of the people on this earth today, what is it now? 7.6 billion people. These figures have been exploding, and where perhaps in parts of Asia or Central Asia, Africa, people could move, and that was the normal part of life because the population numbers have gone up so much, and the pressure on resources that is less feasible now than it could be. But it seems to me that just because we can't do it all doesn't mean that we shouldn't do something. And it particularly to set the example that if the rest of the countries in the world, particularly our European friends, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, countries like this, work together with us, will help, and we set some standards about world behavior, and at least it helps some people. And I'm willing to help some people even if I can't help everybody. And I think that's what most of us come to in our daily lives. It again goes back to the big picture and what is possible and what is not possible. I think if we were to really up refugee admissions numbers, we would meet more political opposition today in this country. I think it's just a fact of life. And so you adapt to that. And you work to make the resettlement programs better and more effective, and so that these people can fit into an American life that we would like to see for everybody, but it doesn't mean that we're going to stop caring for the people at home that need help and other people. I just think it has to be part of a picture of what we do.
Thank you. By the way, lest it be seen that I'm completely the Crow government representative, I just want to note my father came as a refugee from a year in a concentration camp, actually, and that I remember as a youth sharing my room with a Hungarian who we were giving refuge to in the Hungarian resettlement program after the revolution, not to mention a few matters of my diplomatic career. Phyllis, you made a very interesting point about how individually we make this kind of decision all the time, but we make them on a pretty ad hoc basis, and we're fairly comfortable with that. There's a question of whether one can get political support in a divided nation on an ad hoc basis without sketching out a more formalized limit as well as opening. But let me turn to the local questions. We've got a local expert. How would you describe both the possibilities and the limits of absorption and refugee resettlement in this community?
I think history has shown that, regardless of how we resettle refugees across the country, the sense of community and relationships are primary, and that's really important. So lots of studies on secondary migration, which has led the Twin Cities metropolitan area to actually have a really high concentration of Somali refugees, former Hmong refugees. And I think that our region is actually stronger for it. So I think some of it is that we get locked into deficit thinking with these populations, and we shouldn't. We kind of get into binary thinking, dichotomous thinking. The state that people arrive in is not the state they stay in. So I lost that refugee status when I was 10, I think. So the fact that it's referred to and that it's sort of novel is, it's like so many people's American stories, so we have to kind of get used to that. And absorption is really about understanding that we are a country of displaced people. Everybody came from somewhere except for the indigenous populations that lived here that we actually destroyed and, changed. So, that at generational amnesia is the legacy of us as Americans. Now, when I became a citizen, I was 12, and my parents became citizens. I had to go through the naturalization ceremony. And I had to learn also all the things that made America what it is today. And I can remember thinking to myself that even as a new American, that I probably understood best what it meant to safeguard our country and what it truly meant to have liberty and freedom. And that is a lesson that native-born people who grow up with the privilege of never having to go through that naturalization ceremony and to really think about what being an American really means, that, some people grow up with it because they were the child of, some, and, that's really important. So I think that that's probably the wrong question to ask. I mean, it's kind of like, it's this question, it's probably more, what do we want to represent as a country because of the way we were founded, and when will we lose the legitimacy in the world as a country because the sovereign that we have is no longer effective to enforce the rule of law for defense and for other things, because the people in the country no longer believe in the democratic ideals that we have. I think that's a better question probably, because that's the question, because, it's sort of like if you have the power and you're not willing to wield that influence across the world, then yeah, you may be stuck with things that you don't want to be stuck with, but how will history judge us as a world and as a nation? And can we bear and tolerate that as people who actually must be together? There's this thing about being human. You can't be human without another person to validate you. That's just basically what this is about. So I think that, politics is, of course, the reconciliation of all of these different competing interests. So, that happens at the local integration level. It happens on the world stage. And and nationally and statewide. And, there are lots of sets of choices along the way, but it's usually not a binary. It's not usually this or that. That's just wrong thinking.
You make a very interesting point with the binary, not having a binary choice, particularly since we have become more and more a binary nation, it seems, recently, and are facing binary choices. Binary choices in a nation of 300 million people mean gridlock and lack of policy, and endless descent into name-calling without solutions. But recognizing that there are these strains now, we're where we are. Let me go back once across the panel shortly to say, if you have, and so I'm going to ask you a question which obviously isn't short, but that's privilege of the moderator. What would you tell policymakers ideally about how do you sketch a policy with both immigration and refugees which would have a chance of gaining acceptance? Can you only do this by converting the opponents to your, whatever your point of view is, or is there some middle ground between the resistance to more immigration and the goals of, and by the way, I totally agree that if we do not exemplify what we want to lead in, we don't lead. I've never seen others fill up the gap that we create. I remember having that discussion with Secretary Rice once about a particular aid issue, and the point was, well, we can't come up with the money, but we'll get other donors to do it. And I had the dubious satisfaction of telling her a year later that not a single donor had filled any of our unfilled critical needs. They'd done other things that they thought were important, but it's very difficult to lead by jawboning alone, especially if it's toothless. So where would you go to find a middle ground? Let me go ahead. I think we should go back. There's no point giving Eric the lead all the time, so you go ahead and start.
I need to stipulate, the timekeeper tells me that I only spoke for 23 minutes. So I think this business about me talking too long, I've got some questions about it. So,
That's all right. No, I think you ought to start. Go ahead. Go ahead, Bonnie.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like Phyllis or Eric should go first.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Let me. I'm not good on the fly, so give me a minute while you guys respond.
Okay,
Yeah.
let me just say that we could all suck our thumbs and deal with these existential, of how many do we do refugees and this and that. And when you're, facing a budget deadline, you've got to make a decision. I think sometimes that's a good thing because you have to kind of find what works. And while there are huge problems that are coming, there are lots of considerations. Clearly, security is a situation that is more on everybody's minds than it has been. I think the record of refugee admissions has really been outstanding when you look at it, that these large, horrific things like Las Vegas or, Florida or whatnot, those really didn't involve refugees or immigrants, that they were other problems. I think our record on screening refugees in has been very good. Not perfect, can't be. But when you think about it just empirically, it really has done pretty well. So I think you adapt your policies to meet concerns that come up. There's no one perfect formula for this. We've got to respond to public events. And we've got to use common sense in dealing with it. So, I would kind of go on a subject like this of not the philosophical foundations, but whatever works.
Okay, I've thought through my response now.
Okay. I inspired you.
Can you tell I'm an introvert? I have to like think through this first. You know, I do think that the recent immigration and kind of like just the policies that are coming out of the administration, what I don't like about them, and this is not bipartisan or, you know, taking any side, is, you know, they've just, we're racializing. I mean, there is a racialization of our immigration policy towards refugees and immigrants across the world, and I don't like it. You know, I don't think we need division or more division and fear. Fear over facts is how Eric put it. But you know what I see is on the ground, people need the same basic things to live, breathe, be housed, be safe and comfortable. I'm totally with Phyllis on the practical considerations. The other thing I would add is because, you know, we're good data people in Wilder Research, is look at the data. I mean, look at the evidence and the results. I mean, I just feel like if we can't point to the results and we can't come together in the middle, you know, it's not one end of the spectrum or the other, but look at the results of what has happened. Can we de-racialize this conversation? Let's just be really honest about it here, because we're not there trying to protect and keep out, you know, other types of immigrants or refugees. We forget that I feel like the whole country has just an intolerance for difference, and maybe that's what it's about. I don't know, but that's not who we are. You know, I mean, if you look at trace our history, it's been a history of struggle and challenge and reconciling different interests, but we've always made it through, and we have better information now than we've ever had. And I can tell you, because I worked on screening like thousands of refugees. There is no way someone is getting into this country if they didn't have some connection to the U.S. and or a real issue with forced migration. I mean, it's so strictly enforced, especially after 9/11. I mean, I can't imagine anybody getting here who doesn't deserve to be here as a refugee. So I think that just getting the real work on the ground out. I mean, yeah, we need to tell more of those stories and actually put it into policy recommendations and show people what we're doing and show them the facts. I mean, that's what it comes down to for me.
I like your optimism that we could have a fact-based policy.
I mean, that really is the challenge. This, especially in the area of refugees, and I'll get to immigration, but in the area of refugees, this isn't a policy problem. This is a political problem. Yeah. And even on so, for example, since 9/11, the number of cases in which we've resettled upwards of 1 million refugees. The number of cases in which a refugee resettled in the United States has been responsible for an act of terror that has resulted in the loss of an American life, the number of those cases is zero. And so this is really a political issue, not a policy issue. Similarly, Ron asked about, you know, ad hocery in terms of refugee admissions. Well, the fact that we may not be aware of a policy and process doesn't mean that it's ad hoc. In advance of the September 16 meeting of the UN on this issue, the UNHCR took stock of overall worldwide third country resettlement needs. I think the number was probably about 800, 900,000. And there was a calculated effort on the part of governments of the world, led by the United States, to figure out what those numbers could be. The United States decision about 110,000 was not an ad hoc decision; was a carefully considered decision, which, in the grand scheme of things, you know, is the difference in terms of policy impact between 45 and 110. In terms of our capacity to handle that, is negligible. In fact, we do better by resettling that large number. So the problem is not ad hocery; it's a political challenge. How do we deal with the political challenge? And I think it's hard to know when we have an absence of leadership that is committed to trying to get to the right place on these issues. But I think one answer, that demonstrated by my experiences here, is contact and communication between refugee communities and non-refugee communities. It's absolutely critical. But Ron, to finish on your question about immigration. There, I think, again, it's primarily a political problem, but I think in terms of the substantive policy discussion and debate, I think a successful immigration reform will have to demonstrate not only on the one hand a capacity to legalize, a capacity to deal with the DACA kids and other issues, but also a credible capacity to address issues of immigration enforcement. But even there, it's a highly politicized situation.
Well, now we've got some questions
Can
from
I
the
say
audience.
an
Yep,
activist
of course.
thing? Okay, so that was the nice policy answer, data, storytelling. You guys have all heard it before, right? It's, get active if you care about this issue. I mean, it's the independent sector, nonprofits, faith-based organizations, rise up and get organized, say stuff. Yeah, that's how it works.
Going out, audience questions. I've prodded you enough. I've got two that I think are related. One notes that the refugee program after the Vietnam War succeeded in part because of a U.S. sense of responsibility for the war as well as the refugees. Do you see Americans still feeling this sense of responsibility, particularly given that many refugees are coming from interstate conflicts in which we're not a party? And related to that is this a question of, do we ensure that they are not stuck in poverty and dependent on welfare when they come to the U.S.? A questionnaire says most of them work in factories that pay $10 an hour, and that's definitely not enough for a subsistence. On the one hand, do we have a sense of moral responsibility? And on the other hand, what is the economic burden? Are we bringing them here to keep them poor?
Okay, small questions. Well, from my perspective in working with refugees and immigrants at the local level, I think that sense of responsibility very much exists in faith-based communities, in the just in the community at large, and maybe that's because it's Minnesota and there's this helping tradition. But I think it's unusual to have like a center for victims of torture in the Twin Cities area, or other types of refugee organizations. So I think that that's one marker of engagement with the community. Do people care? Do they feel a sense of responsibility? Activism is still happening here, right in the Midwest, so I'd say yes. Most refugees, I think the Hmong and Vietnamese and other groups that came after, refugeeism as we know it, 1975, 1976, Refugee Act of 1980, when lots of refugees started getting resettled here. Most of those folks are no longer in poverty. And people do better if we invest. It's like any other racial group or ethnic group or any other family. If we make that investment when the families are young, that virtuous cycle of productivity and growth and contribution to society just simply continues into the future. So where it doesn't work is if families fell into poverty, refugee families fell into poverty, they did not get the assistance they needed from like the Wilder Foundations or Lutheran Social Services, or moved out of those factory jobs, then they fall victim to generational poverty, which is toxic because they can't get out of those low-income neighborhoods and places. I would say that now at the Wilder Foundation, we see some of those families. It's not for lack of trying, but it's domestic policies on welfare or other types of policies that are impacting them. There's structural reasons why. You're not healthy as a refugee family, you're not coming to the U.S. TB tests, like chronic disease tests. It's like, I did the health screenings. You know what? You got to be almost 100% healthy to actually resettle in a third country. If you're not allowed to come. Just saying, you stay there, you get treatment, you get turned away. America only takes the healthy, just letting you know. So,
That's an old story. Former mayor of New York, LaGuardia, was a U.S. vice consul in Italy. And at that point, this is sort of an interesting footnote to history on how diplomacy and immigration intertwined. Immigrants got here, and then they got their medical exam at Ellis Island, and or wherever they landed. And in some cases, of course, you ended up with families being split because somebody was turned back
Yes.
because of the screening. And LaGuardia got that turned around to get the shipping companies to do it before they left. But the way he did it was to exercise this limited power of the consulate. He wouldn't sign the documents that got the shipping companies paid unless they agreed to take the refugees first. So it was an interesting little example of how these things can work together. Eric, I could see you wanting to get into that last question.
I want
Phil,
to
go ahead.
insert something here. In the period, probably 70s, 80s, even 90s, if refugees had a choice, whether they wanted to be resettled in a European country or in the United States, they all wanted to come to the United States because they could work. And in many of the European countries that took in refugees, they were put on welfare, which was generous and caring, but they couldn't work because it would compete with, the local nationals. And that was quite an issue. That has changed quite a bit. But I think most refugees were successful in the United States because they could work and they wanted to work. So, these are generalities. But then there are the exceptions. And in Washington, I have been working and helping with some people who are resettling Syrian refugees. And I had heard about a Syrian family with 8 or 9 children that came to the U.S., and the father is blind and illiterate. And, I'm kind of thinking, why did this happen? Because he's never going to be able to support his family. His children will grow up and support him. But, I think on admissions like that, somebody's got to say, this isn't going to work, and he's going to be better off in a local refugee situation where there is a different kind of care. Some of you may have heard stories like this. Maybe you have. And so I think it behooves all of us who've been involved with the policies to pay attention to these issues, and that they are problems, and that you've got to find the right balance and really what works.
Well, let me say on that issue, I want to talk about this issue of the question that was asked, because I think it's a very important one, about American sympathy for refugees. But on this particular issue, it raises sort of a policy and ethical issue. For years, our refugee resettlement program, the U.S. refugee resettlement program, focused on issues of vulnerability. It's complicated because you've got a ton of refugees around the world, so there are going to be some decisions about which classes of people you're going to be considering. But within those classes, our program focused on vulnerability. For the first time this year, the Trump administration has put language into the refugee determination documents that talks about issues relating to the capacity of people to assimilate. And to me, that is extremely troubling, because what characterizes our society is our diversity. There is no American ethnicity. And so I think we have to be aware of those kinds of factors that are at play. But in terms of the question that was asked, you need to be aware that the refugee resettlement program in the United States, until 2015, was a program that enjoyed broad bipartisan support. There was never any challenge from the Congress or the American people to the numbers that the administration came forward with each year. And that changed in 2015. And the program became mired in partisan political conflict. And now it is, that is the situation that we confront right now. And it's a very difficult and challenging one that we have to figure out a way to climb out of, because it's not fact-based, it's fear-based, but it's real. And it's a political challenge that we need to figure out how to address.
That's a really important point, that fears are also real.
Yeah.
That you're dating it in 2015, not in our, granted, we had a 2 or 3 year presidential campaign, but still that becomes the issue in 2015, already before 16, is I
Right,
think.
but
an
it was
interest-
stoked enormously. And then the other thing, the other comment I have to make is leadership here is so critical. The American people have instincts and inclinations, but people have stuff to do. They don't spend their time thinking about, issues of international affairs. So what leaders say, what instincts and inclinations our leaders tap into is absolutely critical in this area. And we're seeing that day in and day out.
I have a particular question that I want to make sure we get to before we run out of time here, because these are all interesting questions and we can spend a lot of time on them. And that is, what is your advice to students to take advantage of what they have here and similar programs to become leaders on this issue?
You mean beyond taking my
My course,
non-credit
yeah.
course this February
Well, maybe
2nd
ju-
and 3rd?
Maybe just a little bit more.
Okay, I'll start because I'm the local person. Get out and actually get to know some of these communities. Go volunteer. I actually just met someone today who's actually volunteering for our youth leadership program at the Wilder Foundation, and those are refugee kids. I mean, they are ready to learn. They're bright-eyed. They want to do the best they can. They're working really hard. It's hard to judge people when you get to know them and actually have a relationship and understand how hardworking they are, how challenged they are, how just a little bit of support goes such a long way. So for students who are wanting to be engaged in this line of work, there's just great organizations here in the state of Minnesota, including the state of Minnesota. I mean, it's a great place to go intern, to go do stuff. There's right down the street. There's a huge Somali community, but don't stay inside of the walls of the Humphrey School, although you should take Eric's course. So you have kind of the policy background.
Sound like a paid political announcement.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's get out there, get to know people who are different. Immigrants and refugees are not people that you think of necessarily. They're not like what you think of in your head. And the more we bust those assumptions, the better, quite honestly, because we tend to live in very small, I think this is some of the gridlock, we tend to live in very small social circles. We talk to the same people, we socialize with the same people. It's like really hard to get out, So thanks for coming here.
I would say something else, two other things. First of all, obviously, local organizations are extremely important, but also we, think about national organizations engaged in policy for internships and opportunities. Those are very valuable. But I would say something else, and I don't know how you do this, but I think the areas where hostility towards refugees are the most profound are the areas that are least diverse. And when Mike talks about engaging with communities that you don't have familiarity with, you think, well, refugee communities. But also, communities, I think education, political organizing, engaging with refugees in places where there aren't lots of refugees. Because until we have a conversation, a productive dialogue with people who are so fearful about what's going on, then we're not going to get to a more comfortable place. And so I think our educational institutions, the Humphrey School, has a deep obligation to not only speak with like-minded communities, but to go out into rural parts of Minnesota and other places where this fear and hostility is so great, and figure out ways to engage. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to crack this nut.
And boy, is that an important, that's a point that each of you has made that goes so far beyond this issue. The need to engage with people of different viewpoints, to get out of safe space. Was pointed out to me recently that we have moved in many cases from ideology to dogma. and that from ideology to dogma. That is, ideology is a set of ideas, but they can be challenged, and you can argue, and you have to rebut attacks. And by rebutting attacks of the ideas, you sharpen the ideas, but you also learn what other people think. Dogma is the recitation of a mantra. It's not open to challenge. And the more you stay in safe space and only repeat your own particular mantra, you not only don't convince others, you don't learn. So that's really important. Another question is, considering federal policy trends, are there tools or ways that states can act to welcome and support refugees differently? Not sure how you engage on that one, but.
Well, I mean, I could say that, you know, during some of the consecutive proposals around immigration and limiting immigration and just kind of racializing it, and that, you know, there were governors across the country that really made a public statement and proclamations supporting immigrants and refugees, and I was really proud of them, you know, because we are still a nation of states, and, you know, local units of government and leaders at the local level can do a lot, actually, to create safer havens and to actually voice that we should retain policies that have been good for their states and good for America. I mean, that there's some relative autonomy, even with financing, intergovernmental financing flows, and so states can make different choices, as can other local government units. And, you know, that's a strength that we have. It's very fragmented sometimes, but it also allows relative autonomy on issues like this, where people, you know, at different policy levels can have a representative voice or use their influence and power to change the direction of the country. And so, you know, I'm counting on people like that right now, as well as on all of you to actually raise your voices.
The analogy, of course, is the state action, state and local action in the area of climate, and even in the area of migration, refugee issues, states have played a really important role with respect to litigation, a challenging federal government action in these areas, with respect to local programs that don't need necessarily the support of the federal government. But for you students out there, I'd also say you should put some pressure on your university as well. I'm not the dean anymore. I don't have to, you know, I don't have that prudential responsibility.
I'm not
But
sure
on
you'll be
issues
welcome
like the
back.
rights of students and relating to, you know, immigration and DACA, I mean, universities should show some guts on these issues. And I think there are opportunities to press local institutions, not only states, but localities and other institutions of public life to do the right thing.
I'm going to switch.
can I add-
Well, I want to drop one more that you're going to get in on too, but I know you can work it back in if you need to. But this is in a way, it starts as kind of a wonky question on a national level, but I think it's important to explain. And that is, you have the Population, Refugee, and Migration Bureau, and it's under threat, whether it should be folded into aid, whether it should be folded into Homeland Security. It's not just a question of status, of the threat, but I'd like to broaden the question I have here is particularly what's happening with that. But I'd like particularly to turn to Phyllis and to Eric, because we're going to run out of time, but briefly, explanation of what this organization does, why State Department should be a centerpiece of this, why this matters.
Well, I feel very strongly as I look at the U.S. government, and particularly with the appointments of the current administration, there has been a real emphasis on the military and what the military's role is overseas, and in all sorts of affairs. Now, I'm all for having a strong military, but I'm also very much in favor of a strong diplomatic power by the United States on leadership and leading countries into cooperation and working together, because on none of these problems can one country do it alone, and we have to do it. I happen to think the State Department does a better job on that than the military does. The humanitarian budget in the State Department is now its biggest budget. Over $1 billion a year goes into what we give to support refugees and vulnerable people around the world. I have always felt that we have not given enough emphasis and publicity to that. Now, I don't know why the Obama administration didn't do it, whether they were worried that people would say, oh, look what they're doing abroad and they're not helping people at home. But I think most Americans would be very proud of that. And I think we ought to emphasize things like that rather than some other things. When I would go into a room when we were discussing the American approach to Rwanda, there came the military, oh, we can handle it, lady, and we can do this, and we'll do that. And I would say, well, what are you going to do about the relief organizations? We handle those, and we'll take care of those using the established rails and communications. In my view, that's the way it should work. I'm all for augmenting the power of the State Department, and if that means increased budgets for humanitarian affairs, so be it. It gives us greater clout at the diplomatic table, at the White House policy meetings, and I think, looking at it all, I worry about shifting too much to the military. I want to keep the civilian and humanitarian efforts of this government and country front and center. So, I take a governmental professorial viewpoint on that, and I really do think it's important. I just want to interject one comment about young people getting involved. The really moving refugee stories of resettlement in the United States come from the local level. Cities and towns or organizations who have made special efforts to bring communities together, civic groups, and whatnot. And again, I don't think those efforts get enough attention and enough applause, because that's what makes the whole thing work.
Thank you, Phyllis. First of all, on this issue of organization, if you really want we've done a report, U.S. World Leadership on Refugee and Displacement Crisis and U.S. Government Reorganization. It was a report of a task force. You can find it on the Refugees International site, and it kind of describes this issue. But let me give you the thumbnail on this. The U.S. government provides overall, actually, at this point, about $7 billion a year overseas assistance, and the numbers at state actually are much larger now. From the bureau that Phyllis and I ran at separate times, about $3.5 billion, and about the same amount from the U.S. Agency for International Development. Right now, but the White House came up with a proposal many months ago to basically eliminate the State Department Bureau that deals with refugees. And they said the part of the State Department Bureau that deals with refugee admissions, that's going to go to the Department of Homeland Security. And the part of the State Department that deals with overseas assistance, that's going to go to USAID. And that's the idea that many of us are fighting very vigorously right now against. Why? Well, first of all, a refugee admissions program that goes to the Department of Homeland Security, that's a reflection of the fact that this will now be seen as an immigration enforcement effort, not an expression of U.S. international humanitarian obligation. It's ridiculous, especially when the Department of Homeland Security today has to approve every single refugee who comes into the United States. So that's half of the proposal. The other half, which is, to my mind, just as nefarious, is to move the State Department's overseas assistance into USAID. Now, that seems, on some level, to make, well, why not? AID does assistance as well. But if you look at the agencies that the State Department support, it's the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, it's the International Committee on the Red Cross, and it's the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. Those three represent the majority of that $3.5 billion, right? And what is it about those organizations that make them distinct? It's that they deal with issues relating to conflict. They deal with issues relating to conflict where diplomacy, where the role of the State Department is so critical. So many of us have argued, and they deal with issues of protection of refugees, which AID is not focused on. So while this is in the weeds, it's an important issue, because if the Department of State doesn't retain those functions, then that protection responsibility will also go away, and that will be very dangerous for U.S. foreign policy. So that's the issue to which Ron has just alluded.
Thank you. I think, aside from the fact that we've run out of time, that's actually not a bad stopping point, because it brings us back, in a sense, to where we started. That the circle, the international role, the foreign policy role, the domestic role, the resettlement, are all together. You can deal with managerially with this piece or that piece, but you've got to keep an eye on the fact that they are all in it together. That it isn't just a humanitarian issue or an issue of morality or an issue of foreign policy or an issue of security. It's all of them. And if you don't know that it's all of them, you probably can't make good policy out of it. And on that note, I thank my panelists. I thank the Humphrey School. Thank you all for coming. And what discipline, we're on time.
Did I mention my course? I just don't know.
Ad nauseam.
You can't accuse me of not trying to get people in my class, right? Hello, Maureen.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah.